However, there are 4 very distinct lines of evidence that even on their own are quite convincing, but when you combine them together, create an extremely compelling evidence-based story for the paleo approach, the paleo template. So number 1 is archaeological studies. So we look at fossil remains and how fossil remains changed from hunter-gatherer period to agricultural period. And one of the biggest changes that we see in fossil remains was that as our ancestors moved from primarily a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to primarily an agricultural lifestyle, they shrank. The average height of men decreased by 6 inches during that transition, and for women it decreased by 5 inches. So that's not an insignificant change. And while within a population the variance in height from person to person is not necessarily an indicator of health status. I'd like to believe it is, personally, but it's not. But from one population to the next, it is. And it typically is a reflection of the nutritional status of that population because, of course, we need nutrients like calcium, like vitamin D for our skeleton to develop properly, plenty of protein to produce enzymes and all the tissues that we need to function well. So the second line of evidence is anthropological. So this is where we study contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, which unfortunately there are few of now that haven't had a lot of contact with the Western world, that have maintained their traditional diet and lifestyle. And we compare their health to the health of people living in industrialized populations. And what those studies almost universally show is that contemporary hunter-gatherers are lean, they're fit, obesity is essentially unheard of, and even being overweight is extremely rare. There's no diabetes, there's no heart disease, there's no autoimmune disease, there's no allergies, there's no asthma. So they're superior in all of those ways, and they also are superior in almost every measure of health and fitness, from insulin sensitivity to body mass index to oxygen consumption, which is one way of measuring physical fitness, to vision, to bone density. So then we have biochemical studies. So these are studies that look at, for example, the nutrient density of foods and also the nutrient completeness of a particular diet. And as we'll see in more detail in the next 2 slides, paleo comes out very well in those biochemical studies. And then finally, we have the much lauded gold standard RCTs, randomized clinical trials. And we do, in fact, have 8 or 9 now RCTs, randomized clinical trials, that have all been extremely encouraging. Some of them have been relatively small studies, so we definitely want to see bigger studies, and we want to see these studies replicated. But some of the results were quite phenomenal. In a couple of the studies, paleo was superior to the Mediterranean diet in terms of weight loss and improvements in metabolic markers. And perhaps more importantly, it was found to be more satiating per calorie than the Mediterranean diet, which means essentially it's easier to stick with because people who follow paleo feel more satisfied, they're not as hungry, and so they're more able to stick with it over the long term.